So good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming. Today's seminar, as you know, is about climate change and health. This is not a new issue, but it's one of increasing importance that is getting close to crucial, I think, in the view of many. Weather and climate have been known to affect human health and welfare for a very long time. In fact, since the 40 days and nights of rain that cleaned up the planet, as described in the book of Genesis. That was a more dramatic event, I'm happy to report, than we're likely to see again, at least I hope so. There is strong evidence that for a very long time, for thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands of years, the climate has been relatively stable and that the atmospheric content of a variety of gases has been more or less stable. There's been a strong temperate trend and nearly constant atmospheric levels, as a matter of fact, of CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases. Those concentrations have been rising, particularly in the last 100 years or so. And as a matter of fact, mean global temperature has increased about 0.6 of a degree centigrade since the 1860s. Rainfall patterns have changed, and in many regions, and sea levels have risen by some estimates as much as 10 feet. So that isn't good news. CO2, as a matter of fact, persists in the atmosphere for up to 100 years, maybe more, so that long-term effects are in store, and turning things around will be a very slow process. Climate will continue to be impacted for the indeterminate future. Current predictions, as you may know, current predictive models suggest that by 2100, mean global temperature will rise an additional 1.8 to 4 degrees centigrade above the 0.6 degrees it has already risen. This also is not good news. A 1 degree centigrade increase in mean global temperature produces about a 6% increase in the atmosphere, capacity of the atmosphere to hold water, leading to heavier rainfall events and flooding. And on the other hand, warmer conditions also increase evaporation and reduce snowpack, leading to drought in areas where snowpack runoff is essential to water systems, as we've seen in California in the last couple of years. An international conference convened by the UN in 2014 concluded that there's clear evidence that human actions, especially burning of fossil fuels, are largely responsible for these changes. And at the current pace of greenhouse gas emissions, there'll be major impacts on health, some of which are already upon us. Current estimates indicate climate change will cause some 250,000 excess deaths annually by 2050. There's strong evidence for associated health effects and social impacts, including increased risk of injuries of food and waterborne and vector-borne diseases, as well as social impacts such as mass displacements, disruption of livelihoods, breakdown in food systems, slowing of economic growth, and increased poverty, not to mention the potential for civil unrest, social instability, and local and regional conflict. It's been suggested, in fact, that climate-related droughts in major wheat exporting countries, with the resulting doubling of wheat prices, may have been a contributing factor in the political eruptions of the Arab Spring, and that drought-induced crop failures, with resulting food insecurity affecting 1 million people and 2 to 3 million farmers, contributed to the Syrian civil war crisis. These climate-related phenomena are characterized by national disparities, regional variation, and complex health effects, not only immediate, but unfolding over decades. Climate change is a particular risk multiplier in the social and health arenas in vulnerable countries. The Paris Agreements of 2015 focused on mitigation of causes, a move in the direction of primary prevention through reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, to the extent of a 2-degree centigrade limit above pre-industrial levels in average global temperature increase as a long-term goal. The implications of adaptation policies inside countries, the analogs of secondary and tertiary prevention, through, for example, food and water planning, disease surveillance, or immunization programs, are to be worked out. There's an enormous need for systems planning and in coherent anticipatory policy development and implementation planning. The UN conference concluded that the health sector is only weakly involved in responding to these challenges, even though health benefits are some of the biggest and most immediate payoffs from low carbon choices. The health sector needs to get its act together and provide a stronger voice, not only to its immediate constituencies, but to policy at national and international levels. And we're lucky to have with us today 2 genuine experts in this area, both major contributors to current thinking and research. Dr. Christy Ebi is a professor in the Department of Global Health in the School of Public Health at the University of Washington. She holds a master's degree from MIT and an MPH and a PhD in epidemiology from the University of Michigan. And among many honors, she has served as a member of the NAS-NRC Board on Environmental Change and Society, as a member of the NRC Committee to advise the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and on the NRC BECS Study Committee on assessing the impacts of climate change on social and political stresses. She's published extensively, is a widely sought consultant and lecturer. Dr. Jeffrey Shaman is an associate professor of environmental health sciences here at the Mailman School. He holds a baccalaureate degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD from Columbia. His particular field of interest is climate, atmospheric science, and hydrology, as well as biology, especially environmental determinants of infectious disease. Infectious disease transmission. He's investigated how hydrologic variability affects mosquito ecology and the transmission of mosquito-borne diseases, and how atmospheric conditions affect the survival, transmission, and seasonality of pathogens. And we'll start with Dr. Ebi. Christy, all yours.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that kind introduction. Thank you. And I appreciate all of you showing up today. So I wanted to start with a few slides that will illustrate what you just heard to give you a mental image to go along with those words. I assume you know something about climate change, so I'm just going to highlight a few issues that are important for the health sector. And I'm going to start with some pictures I took out of a video put together by NOAA, taking a look at climate change since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Climatologists analyze data much the way we do in health. They look at anomalies around baselines. I don't know about you, but when I took stats classes and I took z-scores, I really did not like z-scores. And I'm now spending my life working in a field where everybody basically does z-scores. So these are z-scores, and it looks at a baseline of 1961 to 90. Climatologists use a 30-year period to describe climate. Climate and weather are part of a continuum, but climate is 30-year averages of particular weather variables in a particular location. So it's just like a z-score. So this shows right after the start of the Industrial Revolution. You can see the time period. You've got the scale up here. And you can see that most of the world right after the start of the Industrial Revolution was much cooler than it is today. What you'd expect, we've had climate change going on since then. You can see particularly in North America, it was considerably cooler than today. This is 100 years after that. This is 10 years after the previous slide, and this is 10 years after that. And it makes 2 points. The amount of change has been extensive. 3 points, actually. The amount of change is extensive, the pattern of change is unequal, and the rate of change. The rate of change is really important for many of the issues in health and in ecosystems. The rate of change right now is faster than it's been in 10,000 years. I give talks on public health. People usually say, gee, how discouraging. I always say, go talk to people in ecosystems. There's ecosystems right now in the US that are labeled functionally extinct. They're not going to survive. That our ecosystems did not evolve during a period where there's this rapid amount of change. And we know that some of the cloud forests and some of the other ecosystems will not survive climate change. As was mentioned, we've got projections of what's going to happen out towards the end of the century. This black line shows you the observations. We've got observations. We've been putting out thermometer and rain gauges since about 1860. These are projections from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, this assessment report. The blue line and then the band around it is pretty moderate emissions towards the end of the century. There's assumptions in that model that we'll have negative emissions by the end of the century, that will be able to pull our emissions down and have them negative, doing this by carbon capture and sequestration, for example. The top end are high-end emissions. And one of the points on this is, as you look at the shaded area, the uncertainty bands, that the top projection is for almost a 6 degrees C increase in global mean surface temperature by 2100. This is the same difference in global mean surface temperature between now and the last ice age. And it's not doing it in hundreds of thousands of years, it's doing it in 100 years. Again, rate is really important. So instead of spending more time on this, I like to put this slide up. Climate Central does very clever analogies. This is one that most people remember when you're thinking about that rate of change. By the end of the century, most of the cities that sponsored the Winter Olympics won't be able to do so. They're going to be too warm, they're not going to have snow, and we're going to be looking for new places to hold the Winter Olympics. Because this is going on right now, I pulled this down. It was published a day or two ago about Atlantic hurricanes. And you can see the trend over the decades, that part of what drives a hurricane is the ocean temperature. Warmer air holds more water. Warmer air also warms up the surface of bodies of water. And that temperature in the Atlantic is what drives the strength of the hurricanes. And so we don't necessarily see more hurricanes with climate change. What we see are more intense hurricanes, and when they make landfall, they're more intense. So you think of the 1,000 people who died in Haiti a few days ago. These are the kinds of changes that we are seeing with climate change, that we expect with climate change, and that trend will continue. As I implied, we've also got changes in the hydrologic cycle. This is a projection for return periods of 100-year floods. And basically it says by the end of the century, places that have 1 and 100-year floods are going to have them almost every year. I gave a public talk not long ago. I was talking about this. At the end, a woman said that she'd bought a house somewhere in New England, 120 years old, as I recall. And when she bought it 20 years ago, it had never flooded. So in 100 years, it had never flooded. In the 20 years that she'd owned it, it flooded 6 times. So we're going to see impacts large and small. There's an emphasis, of course, on these very large impacts, on the hurricanes, on major flooding events such as Pakistan a few years ago. But it's also going to affect all of us because we're going to see a real change in patterns. When we talk about climate change and health, it's important to put in the context, as you've heard, that climate change is a stress multiplier. The framing used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is this one. When we talk about the future, we talk about risk. There's been too much of a tendency, and I'm as guilty as everyone else, of talking about future impacts. But when you say impacts, it conveys to policymakers a level of precision that's not there. There's too many uncertainties. Also, policymakers work with risk all the time. They take decisions all the time about, under uncertainty about how things might change. And so it really helps to be clear in our communication. So anyway, when we talk about future risk, when we're talking about a changing climate, that future risk is composed of three basic factors. One are the hazards created by a changing climate, changes in temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, other factors. The human and natural systems that are exposed to that. Public health is pretty much puts together exposure and vulnerability, the third factor. And it's important when we think about climate change to separate those out. The same strength typhoon has hit the Philippines and has hit Japan. Not the same typhoon, but same strength typhoons have hit the Philippines and Japan with very different consequences. There's different coastal hardening, there's different cultures, there's different early warning systems, there's different kinds of infrastructure. And so understanding that exposure component is really important to thinking about what we need to do to be better prepared for a changing climate. The third factor then is the underlying vulnerability. Vulnerability can be decomposed into susceptibility. There's a lot of work that's been done by Pat Kinney and others here at Columbia University looking at heat. And we know a whole group, lots of different groups of people are more vulnerable to heat. Adults over the age of 65, people who want to go out and run every afternoon because they do that no matter what, even though it's too hot. Infants, when they're left in cars. We have a long list of people who are particularly vulnerable, particularly susceptible to weather events. There's also the whole issue around capacity, of how able are individuals and societies to manage that change. And so it's useful for us in public health to think along both of those dimensions, and I'll emphasize those as we go through the talk. And then, of course, a whole range of socioeconomic processes affect vulnerability and exposure, and we've got natural variability and anthropogenic climate change affecting the magnitude and pattern of hazards. This is a great slide put together by CDC about what the health risks are of a changing climate. In the middle, you've got the changes that we're seeing with climate change. Around that, the kinds of changes and exposures that are a consequence. And then on the outer ring, all of, not even all, nearly all of the health outcomes that can be affected. And as you look around that outer ring, that's almost everything a ministry or Department of Health deals with. This cuts across all of the issues that ministries and departments want to better manage. That as we're going forward, as climate change has even more potential to affect human health, we have stovepipe departments, stovepipe ministries, and trying to work across everything from migration to allergies and asthma, vector-borne diseases, undernutrition. It's a big mandate to take on. What you're seeing internationally are efforts for countries to conduct vulnerability and adaptation assessments, and I'll talk a little bit about those, and then to have a contribution to national adaptation plans that all countries are putting together. When we look out a little further into the century, to the 2030s, this is a project done by WHO. By the way, we have very few projections of the health risks of climate change. A theme we talked about extensively at lunch, there's no funding. One of the consequences of no funding in this area, or very little funding in this area, is there's very few projections. So WHO organized this. This is the estimate of 250,000 people dying specifically due to climate change by the 2030s, only from these health outcomes. So think of the previous slide. There's lots of health outcomes that are not included, so we know this is an underestimate. The other point is when you think about what causes climate change, the burning of fossil fuels, there's 7 million people who die every year associated with the burning of fossil fuels. So when you take that collectively, it's a very large portion of the burden of disease in many countries. And public health has been dealing with climate-sensitive health outcomes for a very long time. Most of you, I assume, have had courses in public health. You know, we focus on primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. I spend a lot of time talking outside of public health. That's not well understood. So I've translated that to reduce exposures, prevent onset of adverse outcomes once people are exposed, and then response and treatment once adverse outcomes have started. And for each of those, we have a whole series of policies and programs in place. We've got projections of malaria changing its range. We're watching malaria change its range in several locations. Climate change is going to facilitate that. It's going to offer opportunities for mosquitoes to change their range, but those are not new diseases. If we could control malaria now, we could control it in 2100. We're not. We have a lot of work to do, and climate change is going to work against the efforts that we're doing. As climate change offers these opportunities, it's going to be more difficult to control some of the diseases we're working so hard to do. I put this up here. I thought you guys might appreciate this. I took this out of the Library of Congress. This is from just past the mid-1800s. For those of you who remember your history, in that time period, the major port in the US was New Orleans. So most of the goods brought into the US came through New Orleans. And then New Orleans had a series of outbreaks of yellow fever carried by the same mosquito that carries Zika, chikungunya, and dengue. And so the ships were put into quarantine when they came into port. Ship owners then are not any different than ship owners today. They were not ecstatic about shipping their goods across the ocean and having them sit in New Orleans for a couple of weeks waiting for them to be offloaded. So this was put together by New York City. So what you see in the back is the Port of New York City. It's lovely and clean. The angel is public health. She's got a badge on that says cleanliness. What you can't read is the tape across says quarantine. The title is at the gates, and the three figures at the gates are cholera, yellow fever, and smallpox. We know for sure that cholera and yellow fever are climate sensitive, that climate change could affect those. So there's been efforts for more than 150 years to try and manage these health outcomes. The problem is we've done it without thinking about climate change. And so we're ill-prepared because we haven't looked at one of the major drivers of these different health outcomes. The other side of this, if you have not found this, I highly recommend you looking at this, is I talked about capabilities, and each country has a unique set of capabilities. A group of people got a bunch of data from the World Bank and other places, have put this together, it's online. What each country leads the world in, the US leads the world in Nobel laureates and being killed by lawnmowers. You can read Canada leads the world in maple syrup and asteroid impacts. Australia leads the world in deadly animals and melanoma. And it makes a great point of there are different capabilities in different places, which is both an opportunity and a challenge for public health. In public health, we really know how to do a top-down program. Right now, there is going to be lots of money going into developing a vaccine for Zika. Public health, we're going to go out, we're going to vaccinate. We know how to do that. We're not so good at figuring out how to work when there's different risks in different places, where your malaria control program needs to be modified depending on the place, depending on the capabilities, depending on the perceptions of malaria in a particular village. And we haven't developed that as strongly. And climate change is asking public health to change, to think more about those kinds of differential vulnerabilities and how we as public health professionals can work with communities to help address those changes. I didn't put it in, but I often put in a figure, a photograph from flooding in Mozambique in the year 2000. It shows extensive flooding. I saw a presentation about this flooding the following year, had one slide on the health risks of that flooding event. More than 1 million people were affected. 15,000 people were rescued from trees by helicopter. A woman gave birth in a tree. And this person giving the presentation listed the 10 top causes of morbidity and mortality. And I always tell the audiences that they can guess what's on that list except for number 2. I've given you the information, but you don't know it. The number 1 cause of morbidity and mortality was the floodwaters themselves. I'm trying to make a point about this differential vulnerability. So what do you think is on that slide of what would cause morbidity and mortality in that kind of event? Somebody? Come on, somebody's got to guess. Diarrheal disease, very good. That was on the slide. What else was on the slide? It's Mozambique. Undernutrition is on the slide. You can imagine extensive flooding throughout the country was a real problem. Vector-borne diseases, malaria. Malaria is a big problem in Mozambique. We can go through and you can guess what's on the slide. The second cause of morbidity and mortality was landmines. It was right after the Civil War ended. There was 1 million unexploded landmines. They washed down out of the highlands and children found them. I know a lot about climate change, but I don't know a lot about individual vulnerability. I work in a lot of countries, and they are the experts. They're the ones you have to work with because they're the ones that you have to figure out what is it you need to do. And so that's a new model for public health, that kind of very close partnership to make sure that we're as effective as possible. I cut this out of a newspaper, makes the same point. One time I was in New Delhi, they were having a big outbreak of dengue. This is a half-page ad in the newspaper, all about dengue and trying to get people to clean up breeding sites. And I cut it out because of that. Almost 18,000 people have been prosecuted because they hadn't cleaned up breeding sites around where they lived. How many people do you know have been prosecuted for having vector-borne disease breeding sites in their backyard? Right. India can do a lot of things that we can't because they've got rules in place, regulations in place. And so you also need to take this into account. I was going to talk a little bit about some of the health outcomes. This is a picture from Haiti. We're seeing more of these extreme events. The IPCC did a special report on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters. Many of these are becoming more frequent and more intense. That all of our lives are going to be characterized by even more extreme events going forward. As the magnitude and pattern of climate change increases, we are going to be dealing with these for decades to come. And it doesn't take an extreme event to have an extreme impact. This is another point I'd like you to remember from this. It's one of the points made really strongly in this report from the IPCC that you can have extreme impacts, if you think back to that flower diagram, because you've got very high vulnerability. And this is a cholera outbreak. I don't have the data for the cholera outbreak ongoing in Haiti, but it's the same issue, where you take an area, you introduce an extreme event. In this case, it wasn't that extreme. It was just having flooding events, introduce cholera, largest outbreak in Africa. This is still ongoing, and it's spilled over to other countries. Heat. There was comments in March already that 2016 will be the warmest year on record. I don't know if any of you saw the Jimmy Kimmel video a couple of months ago about climate change. And he made the point of 2014 was the hottest year on record until 2015 was the hottest year on record, and 2016 is going to be the hottest year on record. He said, you know, it's climate change when the hottest year on record is this one. But we are just blowing away all the records this year. And that affects health. There is this misperception across much of the health community that people who grow up, who live in warm places, are more adjusted to the heat. That's only in places like this where you have a heat wave where you see high mortality. Does anybody know the state in the US with the highest heat-related mortality? What's that? It's Arizona. People are not as adjusted to the heat as we think they are, and this is an example from a heat wave last year in India and Pakistan. And you can see thousands of people dying in the heat waves. There's a lot of effort worldwide. Oh, I didn't need to put this in. I was looking for something else. There's a big heat wave in China recently, and I found this picture, and that was my response, like, wow. That's what you do in China when there's a heat wave. Sorry, that's kind of disruptive, but another point about the heat is it affects worker productivity. And there's a growing number of efforts to estimate how much current increases in heat are affecting worker productivity. It's just getting too hot. I live in Seattle. There's a study going on right now looking at roofers because they're going out in temperatures that didn't used to happen very often are now happening very regularly. We had a very warm summer, not this summer, but the summer before. I was trying to tell somebody about how hot the summer was, so I looked up some information on it. And in a normal summer, Seattle has, I think it's something like 2,400 minutes over 80 degrees. And the summer before, we had something like 13,000. And so people are going out and working in climates that they're not used to, and we are seeing impacts on worker productivity. And what's happening then is many places in the world have developed heat wave action plans. This is a really nice one that is in India. It's an area of India not too far from Pakistan. It's a very hot and dry area. And they've got a very impressive heat wave early warning system. And to try and emphasize how these issues ripple out in lots of different ways, I happened to be at one of the early meetings around this. We had a meeting at the hospital, and the hospital was talking about they're having problems with neonatal mortality because a neonatal ward was on the top floor of the hospital, and I believe it had a metal roof. And they were seeing more of these heat waves, and so they had to reorganize the hospital. In another area of India, someone just finished a study looking at heat over on the opposite side of India, and there's places that are getting up to 50 degrees C. The government put in a bunch of healthcare centers and they put in asbestos roofs. The physicians won't even stay inside during the day. People come in suffering from heat stress and they put the IVs in them outside under the trees because you can't go into the building. So you can start seeing how this ripples out. It's not just what we do directly in public health, but it's the health services, it's infrastructure, it's thinking about how we organize and manage our day-to-day life in cities. Where are we going with heat? This is projections that were done for the special report on extreme events by Noah Diffenbaugh and others. They took 85 to 2005 as a base period, 26 world regions, and they asked what is the highest temperature that occurred in that 20-year period. So for many of you, it's what is the one hottest day that you experienced in your life. Most of you look like you're not that far past 20. And then they said in June, July, and August, moderate emissions, high emissions for these time periods, how often would that temperature occur in the future? And so you can see with high emissions, which is where we are right now, on the top right-hand side, there's parts of the world where that temperature now is occurring every summer. It's not necessarily once a summer, it could be several times a summer. By mid-century, you guys are all going to be alive mid-century. If we're still in high emissions, you're going to see that one hottest day you've had every single year. And you can see by the end of the century, even with moderate emissions. So heat is going to be a real challenge in public health. We've got programs that are dealing on it. There's a lot more that we need to understand. Ozone. Pat's done some really great work on ozone for the Northeast. This just came out looking at temperature, ozone, and ozone-related premature deaths under 2 different climate models in 2030. And you can see the increases in temperature, how that affects the increases in ozone, and then the consequences for mortality. And we know that ozone mortality only captures a small fraction of the total burden of disease associated with ozone. So ozone is going to be a problem. In many ways, it's much more difficult to try and figure out how to manage. The only thing we can really do is reduce what comes out of tailpipes. If we don't do that, there's really very little other than managing caseloads. There's other impacts from a changing climate. It's mostly from increasing CO2. One of them is more CO2, more pollen. When you have CO2, many plants grow faster. And it turns out ragweed and others think this is a great idea. Not only grow faster, but they produce more pollen. So any of you who've got seasonal allergies, season's going to get longer and it's going to become more intense. Undernutrition is undoubtedly the biggest risk we're going to face with a changing climate. This is a map from 2012 showing you, I wonder what happened to the US on that one. It's over here, but disappeared. Showing you the areas in the world where there's challenges with undernutrition. A couple of points. One is that a lot of people are not aware there's more undernourished children in India than there are in all of Africa. And the number is growing. In Africa, there's been a real effort to reduce that. They're making progress on that. And there's been a lot of progress made in the last decade or so in reducing the number of undernourished children. But climate change is going to be working against that. This is wheat and rice, wheat on the top, rice. These are temperate regions. On your right are the tropical regions. Wheat is typical of many cereal crops. When you look at the temperate regions, depending on whether or not you have adaptation, basically wheat will continue to be productive. In some parts of the temperate regions, it's going to be even more productive. We're going to have more bushels of wheat being produced than we have now, just because the conditions will be more favorable because of CO2 and higher temperatures. But if you look in the tropical regions, any increase in temperature is going to decrease crop yields. That wheat and many of the other cereal crops are growing on the edges of their thermal tolerance. So there's been declines in productivity in wheat already. You heard a little bit earlier on how climate change is affecting things like the food riots in the Middle East. Egypt in particular, a large proportion of the diet comes from wheat. Most of their wheat comes from Russia. The heat waves in 2010 in Russia destroyed a significant amount of their wheat crop. Thereby, Egypt didn't get as much wheat. They tried to dilute the wheat with other substances and still didn't have enough to feed the population. There ended up to be food riots. So some of that could be attributed to climate change, some of it's trade, some of it's some other issues. But again, this stress multiplier is really important to consider. This is rice, and basically the issue with rice is a little more mixed. It may be possible that rice would hold out for several decades. There's many areas of the world that relies heavily on rice, which would be good news, but the other cereal crops are not so good news. FAO reviewed all of this, put out a pretty interesting report in 2015, and to go back to the stress multiplier issue, they broke out their data for the first time of not just how many people are undernourished or go to bed hungry every night, but the distribution by countries that are in a protracted crisis or not. And I've got the numbers up there, and it's just stunning what proportion of undernutrition is in a small number of countries that have these protracted crises. And they concluded the typology of these crises are changing. That a few decades ago, Ethiopia, for example, would have some challenges with food security. The World Food Program would come in, there'd be interventions, and then everything would go back to normal. But things are not going back to normal in many parts of the world. Climate change, extreme weather, climate events, and conflicts are coming together, and meaning countries are being unable to get out of this cycle. And so there's going to have to be different kinds of interventions, different kinds of thinking about how to manage this problem. And it's not just the bushels that we're talking about. We're also talking about quality. I mentioned before for pollen that with CO2, plants grow faster. cereal crops are growing faster. They're absorbing the same amount of nutrients. So it's a dilution effect. The concentration of protein, of iron and zinc are going down in most of our major cereal crops. And this is going to affect everybody. This is not just a low and middle income country issue. This is everybody. Our crops are going to be a lot less nutritious. Right now, there's 2 billion people in the world who have micronutrient deficiencies. That's more than twice the number of people who go to bed hungry every night. So a lot of the focus is on undernutrition, but we have to think broadly about what that undernutrition means. It's not just getting the right number of calories. This all affects children. 85% of the health impacts of a changing climate are on children. This is a maternal and child health issue. I'm running a little out of time, so I will run through. I forgot what I put in the rest of this. We've got a framework for a climate resilient health system, WHO put together and published last year. I mentioned at the beginning, countries are developing national adaptation plans. Ministries of health are adding the health component to that. This is a really nice example from Thailand. Put this in just to illustrate the complexity of trying to understand how a health system works in a country, how you work across these different kinds of mandates. I put in Bhutan just because it's a great example of doing that. And I want to end with a couple comments on mitigation. This is a really nice poster from a project that was done in Barbados, training middle school kids about climate change and health. So they put together what they thought could be done in Barbados to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And there is a great example from Thailand. This is a hospital about an hour and a half outside of Bangkok. I will not try to pronounce it. 250-bed hospital, serves 1,000 people per day. They have a green and clean program, where green and clean are acronyms for different activities. And they reduce their greenhouse gas emissions almost 14% 1 year. They track their emissions every day. This reduction is equivalent to planting about 28,000 trees. So you see leadership in lots of different places, people committed to making a difference, and they're doing so. Co-benefits was mentioned right at the beginning, that many of the mitigation policies have real benefits for health. Not only they benefit health, but they benefit health right now. Mitigation policies will take about 4 to 5 decades before they make a difference on climate change. A really nice study out of New Zealand showing just replacing 5% of bicycle trips could save $200 million in health costs, and about 110 people would not die early. And then finally, I wanted to end with the Paris Agreement was mentioned before. As of a couple of days ago, it is ready to be, it's been ratified and will go into force. It was negotiated last December. There was a 2-year period for countries to sign up to say, yes, indeed, they would ratify this agreement. There was a benchmark for how to decide when it was formally ratified, and we've already passed it. The political commitment has been rapid, it's been really strong, and it really is encouraging. Thank you. This one's yours?
That one's mine. So I was asked to come up and give a few additional comments about climate change and health and the impact of a changing climate on human health. And I thought I'd start by just discussing that, a lot of the issues that Christy talked about, they're not new. This is something that humans have contended with for a very long time. And this is a slide I like to use. If any of you ever bother to read the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, when you get to book 7, you'll find a description of the destruction of the Athenian exhibition in Syracuse. And I'm just going to read it. And obviously it's not in Greek, but this is the translation. After a particularly devastating battle, the Athenian generals consulted upon the disaster which had happened and upon the general weakness of the army. They saw themselves unsuccessful in their enterprises, and the soldiers disgusted with their stay, disease being rife among them, owing to its being the sickly season of the year and to the marshy and unhealthy nature of the spot in which they were encamped. That last clause there is the first oldest reference I've ever come across to malaria. Long before germ theory, long before knowledge that the mosquito is the vector of malaria, there was a recognition that there were places and times of the year that were unhealthy and that it was related to the environment and specifically to the climate. Another example of how we've had an understanding of this for a very long time is to look at places, and this is the great Roman bath reconstructed in the city of Bath, but the places where they actually had spas and places that were retreats, places where the waters were healthier and the air was healthier to treat chronic conditions, lung ailments in particular, tuberculosis in the case of infectious agents, but also certainly chronic lung conditions. And if you look at the English language, it's littered with words that sort of spawned out of medical geography. This 16th, 17th, 18th century practice where they tried to categorize it and understand better why some places were good and what were bad, why people would be sent off to mountain airs or to cleaner waters in some place. All right? And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to systematize what is healthful and what isn't. And it's inextricably linked with place and very importantly with climate. So even though they're not explicitly talking about it, in some cases they are actually explicitly talking about it, there's a recognition that human health is linked to climate. And you can still see this today. So this is, if you go to the Lung Institute, I just pulled this up, best and worst places to live with COPD. And it has a whole list of them, and it's based on accesses to hospital, but also air quality and climate. So there's a risk matrix that they're putting in place, and they're deciding what are the places, if you have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, to go that are going to be helpful for you, where you can have the appropriate care, and where the air quality is going to be more conducive for your health. So we now come to a point where we do have this increasing attention on the effects of climate variability and global warming on human health. I think it's very important that we get these baseline understandings of where our set points are. What is the critical things and what are the mechanisms that are actually driving ill health? Because it's only by establishing those baselines, much as in the initial figures Christy showed, that we can actually see how deviations in the future are actually going to affect human health. Now those are going to be projections, but we even have records over the last 100 years, and both in the health and the climate context, to understand how both climate variability and health, and even meteorological variability, different timescales there, are affecting human health. And I think much of that goes back to the point that Christy made at the very beginning, as well as Jerry did as well. We have evolved as society over the last 10,000, 12,000 years with the establishment of agriculture on the Fertile Crescent and the development of civilization in a remarkably stable period of the climate's history. It has been very, very stable in the Holocene compared to what it was before, and certainly compared to what we are doing right now. And the instabilities that we are causing with the changes that we're forcing through the burning of fossil fuels and anthropogenic forcing are creating situations that we're not aware of, such that the rate of change may outpace the ways that humans can follow it or adapt to it, in particular how ecosystems can adapt and follow to that very rapid pace of change. All right, so certainly, and Christy talked about this, there are a number of ways to categorize what goes on. One of the ways that we like to think about it a bit is to think about the number of types of effects. We think about direct effects, things like heat waves, impact of extreme storms, indirect effects, where things that are changing in the climate system may then ultimately have some consequence ultimately for health. And that can be changes in air quality, differences in the frequency of wildfires, changes in the seasonality and the length of the season and the intensity of pollen, how that's going to affect chronic diseases, how that's going to affect water, food, and vector-borne diseases, and how that's going to affect mental health issues. Then the third one is the more complex downstream effects, and this might have to do with food insecurity, climate refugees, and conflict. And I think one of the things we were talking about at lunch is it's important to understand that climate is a stressor within our larger system. And that thinking about climate and health in isolation is a disservice to both of them because it's interacting as one of a number of stressors on things. It could be interacting with war and conflict, with infrastructure that are there, with other components of a system that may be more healthful or more detrimental to human health. So we have to think about it really in a very integrated fashion. So I just have some examples I'm just going to quickly go through. Those are some extreme weather conditions such as Hurricane Sandy. Indirect effects, as Christy already talked about, has to do with changing pollen levels. And then the complex downstream effects may be changes in food production and security. I just want to add that for those of you who don't know about the climate and health program here, that we are studying a lot of these effects. We are not the only climate and health program in the world at this point, certainly, but we are looking at the effects of rising temperatures, drought, heat waves, flooding, et cetera, and we're looking at a variety of outcomes. Some of them are good and some of them are bad. It has to do with heat-related, cold-related deaths, pollen and allergic diseases, respiratory disease outbreaks of sorts, and certainly air pollution. Now, one of the other things that Christy talked about, and that I wanted to touch about as well, is that very often when we talk about just climate and health, we think about it in very broad terms. We think about, let's say, as in this case, rising temperatures. There's some temperature tolerance of the Anopheles gambiae mosquito, which is that guy up on the upper right there, which is the dominant vector of malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. And we think about how that changing tolerance of temperature, well, how the temperature tolerance of the mosquito sets where that mosquito is going to live and distribute malaria. And then we think about, with global warming, how that might change and spread. And yes, it will. It's the potential there, and it's a possibility. But I think one of the things that's very important is that we keep in mind all those other mechanisms that are at play, and not just look at climate and health in isolation. And that we think about it also in terms of a more local perspective, rather than just the broadest terms. Where is it actually going to expand? Where is it going to change? What are the local processes that are at play that are affecting it? Is the ecology of the system going to be important? What about the genetics of the populations that are affecting? In the case of malaria, the mosquito, the pathogen, and the human hosts. What's going on with the medical and public health infrastructure? Can they actually handle it? Houston is by all rights a malaria zone, but they don't have malaria there because they have such an advanced medical infrastructure. There's an established, developed world system in place with infrastructure that's paved the roads, that's drained the swamps, that doesn't husband animals with humans anymore, and people go from their air-conditioned home to their air-conditioned car to their air-conditioned workplace. And they rarely actually interact with mosquitoes, so there's not enough interaction between the vector and host to maintain any sort of transmission cycle locally. And as a result, it's extinguished. So we have to recognize that, but we also have to recognize what are the effects that could actually result in a breakdown of that. And where are the places that are more critically vulnerable? Maybe it's not Houston, but maybe it's somewhere else in the world that's a little bit more vulnerable, that's not as developed. Land use has to be considered, certainly socioeconomic conditions, certainly travel and trade, and certainly issues such as human conflict. And obviously, this is not a complete list, but just some ideas to think about for that. I think the other important thing to realize is that the technology to observe this and to do very detailed work on this actually is coming more and more online. And it's not just the observations of meteorological and climate data and the climate models. It's all sorts of suites of things like big data processing, advanced statistical techniques, high-performance genetic sequencing throughput, GIS systems. All these tools need to be integrated in new and creative ways if we're going to be able to better understand the science of what's going on, make better the understanding of the systems in question, and develop predictions and projections that are actually actionable and useful as we plan. One of the other things that we talk about is that climate change really needs to not just be viewed through a depressing lens, but also as an opportunity. Yes, it's a threat, and it's recognized here in the Lancet report in 2009, but it is also an opportunity, because if we don't take that opportunity and try to make the world a better place with it, then we're just failing ourselves. We have to pick ourselves up and we have to look at what we can do. And co-benefits is certainly one area. You clean up the skies, you get people to use their cars better, it cleans up the skies, it's more healthful if they're walking and biking more. Lots of other co-benefits that people can list where you're actually going to do things that are beneficial both to the climate system and for public health. And certainly the idea of resilience, which Christy described in more detail than I'm going to go into, is very important to think about. The opportunities to make people less vulnerable, to steel themselves in societies for some of the impending problems that may happen. We see that in New York with what's going on, certainly post-Superstorm Sandy, what can be done to shore it up and protect our shores, what makes infrastructure and the electric grid better, what protects the harbors more, what are the things that we can put in place so that the city functions and we don't have blackouts and lost power and people walking people on ventilators down the steps of Bellevue because there's no power in the building. So I'm just going to stop there, and I'm going to say part of the problem, of course, is ourselves. And it's not just something that we can port nebulously everywhere, that the onus is really on us. It's not just our oil companies or our political leaders. We have to think in terms of our own consumption, certainly. Very important that we think about that in that context as we're going forth, and that we think in a more locally integrated way as we're pursuing research agenda while keeping an eye on the global perspective. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Two spectacular talks. We have time for a little discussion or comments. Dr. Baccarelli, do you have anything you'd like to add? No? Dr. Freed?
Well, that was a fabulous duo. I was just sitting here thinking at the intersection of your two talks and have maybe a question or two. And Christy, when you talked about vulnerabilities as needed to be separated from the other two elements, that's very important. And we've been carrying on a lot of discussions within the school where I think increasingly, in my head at least, this concept of just vulnerabilities, whether it's population or the geography or the, in some ways could be thought of as the focus for precision public health, right? So how do you develop the methods, the expertise to be able to analytically combine the different factors that are shaping vulnerabilities and perhaps mitigating it, to be able to develop tailored plans and advice for different locales. So I wanted to get your reaction to that framing, and then also I could add in some other things, but I'll stop there.
That's a really good question. What you're seeing in these efforts to do vulnerability and adaptation assessments and then national adaptation planning is there's a lot of effort in vulnerability mapping, and it's doing just that. It's overlaying different perspectives of vulnerability so that you can start getting a sense of what's the risk in particular places. There's a lot of work that's been done in Phoenix around heat. They've got some really great groups working from multiple different perspectives. One of the things that they've shown is, not surprising, Phoenix is hot in the summer, but it's the low income areas that get hotter because they don't have trees. And so overall the temperatures are higher, and then they've got higher adverse health outcomes in the summer. There's work that's looking at worker productivity by the different kinds of occupations that people have, the flexibility they have to change their work hours. So you're seeing more of this information come out, and thinking about how we can move our public health perspective from this top down to start marrying it with what we call the bottom up. And that's true across all of the sectors, of taking a look at co-production of knowledge, co-production of research, so that you can capture that richness that we may not understand, but that the local communities understand, the local NGOs, the local health departments can work with you, and coming up with ways to target where you do your interventions and be more effective then, instead of, I'll pick on heat again, what we do for heat wave early warning systems. There's been a huge investment in understanding how to define a heat wave. We've got more research on who's vulnerable during a heat wave, and our heat wave early warning systems amounts to the broadcast meteorologist saying it's hot. We should be able to move beyond that to saying it's going to be hot in a few days, and if you've got diabetes, if you're overweight, if you've got these particular conditions, if you take these particular drugs, you're already at risk because you've got a greater sensitivity to the heat, of focusing on communities and having those interventions in place. I think we've got real potential in public health to make a bigger difference than we have.
If I can just add one other corollary, I was surprised that neither of you talked about the importance of redesigning the built environment in cities. So I'll just mention it, but if you roll these up and from a precision public health point of view, you're talking about how to understand the complex system of problems and how to find the optimizing levers that are tailored in a bespoke fashion to that particular location, right?
I'm sure Jeff will say more or less the same thing. Absolutely, that's true. You're given 30-some minutes, and you look at thousands of slides you have, and decide which ones to try and pull up. But you're exactly right, that needs to be done. And we need to work very closely with the people who are redesigning that infrastructure to make sure it's being redesigned in a way that's going to be effective mid-century and beyond.
We were actually talking about at lunch some of those very issues. And just the idea that, you said, what's the path forward for doing this, and some sort of integrated analysis that's there. And I don't have one prescription for it, because I think it's something that a community of experts are going to come together over time to begin to understand. But I think there are going to be certain additional tools that are going to be developed that are going to allow for that kind of integrated assessment. And specifically within the built environment, we were talking about at lunch the need that, there hasn't been investment in things like gas mains and water mains and roads and bridges, and that if we're going to think about this and we're going to start designing cities and invest in reimagining them, we need to make them resilient and appropriately integrated in the thought. I mean, if we could design a new city, we've asked about this, I know I've had conversations with people in engineering about this, what would be the sanitation and water system for a 21st, maybe we should call it a 22nd century city, given the scales at which these things happen? And how do you bring that in so that it is more resilient, and so that you have this ability to combine health outcomes and protect human health in a way that's appropriate? Yeah.
I'll just add one thing to that. When you think about low and middle income countries, there's been discussions in some large cities, they know they're going to have more unplanned settlements. We know that's where large burdens of disease lie. If you don't have enough money to actually build that part of your city out, can you put in the sewer pipes? Can you put in the water lines so at least you can deliver safe water and improve sanitation, even if you can't put the infrastructure around it? So those questions are being asked, and people are looking out towards the end of the century and looking at different pathways of development and how to try and make better choices today that we'll be happy with in the future.
We've got a couple of students involved here. So not a question in the student population here for one of these folks. Don't be bashful. I mean, nobody knows the answer. Well, if you won't, yes, in the back, please.
Thank you so much for your presentations today. They were really, really interesting. I just wanted to follow up. Earlier, you mentioned that there was a lack of funding for research and looking specifically at like quantifying these risks in the context of climate change. And I was wondering if you could comment on that more. Why do you think that's the case? Do you think there's political motivation there? And what do you see for the future of that research and making sure that it's supported and used?
That's a great question. We spent most of lunch talking about that. I had an editorial accepted yesterday. Amongst the points it makes is the Office of Management and Budget reviewed the NIH budget, and the NIH budget on climate change and health is 0.02% of their budget. In DC, there's a phrase called budget dust. 0.02% doesn't arise to dust. You can't actually see that. They haven't funded anything for several years. The situation is only slightly better in Europe. There's a little bit more funding. When you look at the big adaptation funds under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, about $1.2 billion has been invested in adaptation over the last about 15 years, and I think it's less than 3% has gone to health. And there's a number of reasons. Health has been slow to get on board on this issue. There's still lots of people who have low awareness. Public health has moved away from public health. If you go and look at the history of public health, look at John Snow taking the handle off a pump so that people wouldn't get cholera. But public health has moved to focusing on diagnosis and treatment, and by the way, if there's a genetic link, that would be even better. But not in terms of the environment. NIH published their priorities. NIH last year published a new framework for NIH going forward and basically moved away from anything about the environment. They said that they want to take the burden of disease in the US, so I'll make the numbers up. If 30% of the burden of disease is due to diabetes, 30% of the funding is going to go to diabetes. It's not going to go to looking at the broad scale issues. It's just going to go on diagnosis, treatment, genetics, vaccines. And so the framing has been far too narrow by the funding agencies themselves. So there's a number of different factors. As long as I have the mic, the last thing I always ask my classes is, what is the most important thing that you can do to start changing this dynamic? And I'll let you all guess. I obviously have an answer in mind, but I'm happy to hear from some other answers. Vote. Vote what's important for you. There's an election coming up, register to vote and go out and vote for what you think is important. It's only by having people vote and having the politicians who've got the political will to address these issues will we see the top-down changes we need in addition to the bottom-up ones.
We're running over, and I just want to close this by pointing out that there is an enormous amount of money in the system. Mario Cuomo, when he was governor, one year the state was having a terrible fiscal crisis, gave a talk that I attended where he said he was describing the state's fiscal condition, which was abysmal, to his mother. My mother, he said, had a 6th grade Sicilian rural education, but very, very smart. And I was telling my mother all of these terrible fiscal problems, and she said to me, Mario, isn't there a lot of money? He said, yes, Ma, there is. And she said, where is it? And he said, I don't know, Ma. There is a lot of money. The case for this needs to be made in a coherent, vigorous, ongoing, unrelenting way. There is no sense, in my judgment, for the public health community or the clinical community to sit around saying this is underfunded or this is poorly funded or this isn't getting what it should. The case needs to be made in some organized way that transcends individual areas, individual vectors of research, transcends even, I think, individual schools of public health. Some kind of a coherent, organized effort needs to be made. This business about decarbonizing what's happening to the planet is, in the view of many, the most pressing health issue facing us for the next, certainly, century. Anyway, thanks for coming. Please join me in thanking these two extraordinary people.